All right, this is 6.3, solve equations with rational coefficients. So to review, rational just means that it can be written as a fraction. A ratio is the root word there. So we're talking about decimals that either terminate or repeat that can be written as fractions, or any whole number or integer that can be written as fractions, okay? In other words, just none of those non-repeating, non-ending, non-terminating decimals. All right. How do you undo times 3/8? Well, there's two different ways to undo. First of all, the operation is what we want to undo. So one way is to divide by 3/8. Of course, you've heard me say this in class about a million times. We don't divide fractions, we multiply by the reciprocal. So there are actually two ways to undo times 3/8. Either you divide by 3/8 or you multiply by 8/3. Of course, if you're in a calculator, you can just go ahead and divide by 3/8. But if you're doing it by hand, how would you divide by 3/8? You would multiply by 8/3. How do you undo times 3.437? Well, again, it's the operation that changes. You divide by 3.437. And that's why I'm not even sure why this is an entire lesson, because basically it's the same thing that you do with any coefficient. So if you had a -2 as a coefficient, you would say, well, if -2 times k equals 7, then I just need to divide by -2. Divide by -2. Doesn't matter that it's a decimal or a fraction, you do the exact same thing. So let's practice that a little bit. If I were looking at that first one, I would look at what happened. They multiplied by 4/9. So how am I going to undo times 4/9? I'm going to either divide by 4/9 or multiply by 9/4. Remember, those are the exact same math, right? So I would just say, if I did it with a rainbow, I'd say there was a C that they multiplied by 4/9. They got 9 as an answer. I'm going to, well, I'll choose then take it times 9/4 because I'm doing it by hand anyway. So 9 over 1 times 9/4 is 81/4. And then, of course, we would just simplify that down, which I guess I could do. That simplifies down to 20 and 1/4. So C equals 20 and 1/4. If I did the next one, what happened? Well, they multiplied by 2.8. So the opposite of that is to divide by 2.8. Divide by 2.8. This one's called cancellation, by the way, so I'm just canceling that out. That turns into C. When I work the other side, it becomes C equals 1.74. Now, the next one, they multiplied by -2 and 1/3. Okay, so I could divide by -2 and 1/3. If I were doing it by hand, of course, I would need to change that to -7/3 to an improper fraction. So I'm either going to take 7/11 and divide by -2 and 1/3, which would be, that'd be fine. Or if you're doing it by hand, you're going to multiply by the reciprocal. So that would then be 7/11 times the reciprocal, which would be -3/7. Cross simplify, 1, 1. 1 negative makes it negative, and your answer is -3/11. One skill that will help with rational coefficients is if you have fractions involved in a problem. You don't have to do this step, but it can save you some time and effort as you get into upper level math. That is called clearing the fraction. Like, if I don't like these fractions involved in here, you can just treat it like a fraction. You can say, how do I get rid of +3 -3? How do I get rid of times, or get rid of a times 3/5? I just divide by 3/5 or multiply by 5/3, like we just talked about. But another way is to clear that fraction. To clear the fraction, what you do is you find the denominators, and you find a whole number that would knock out those denominators with cross simplification. And a hint for you is that number will be the same as the common denominator. So if I have 5 and 2, then I want to multiply by 10. And what I'm doing is I'm making this entire thing 10 times bigger. Okay? One thing you have to remember is every term is multiplied by 10. Remember, terms being the things added together. On this side, there are 2 terms. On this side, there's 1 term. So I'm going to be distributing that 10 to this piece, and to this piece. So I'm going to show you the cross simplification step. 5 would become 1, and 10 would become 2, and 2 times 3 is 6. So that becomes a 6C. I do that same thing over here. 10 times 3, of course, is 30. And then I do that exact same step over here. Cross simplify, it becomes 1, and that becomes 5. And now you have the equation 6c plus 30 equals 5. I made each one of those 10 times larger. I'll show you that again. Again, I'm looking at the denominators. I see a 4 and a 3. So I'm going to choose 12, the same number as what would be the common denominator. I can still do things like leave change opposite. Now, I'm taking each one of these terms, this term, and this term, times 12. That would cross simplify and become 1 and 3, and then 3 times 3 is 9, so that becomes a 9. When I do a 12 over here, that becomes a 1 and a 4, and I get 4f. And then 12 times negative 2, of course, is negative 24. And a lot of people would rather have the equation 9 equals 4f plus negative 24 rather than 3/4 equals 1/3 f minus 2. Again, we've just made the problem 12 times larger. Be careful though, sometimes you might be confused about how many terms there are. I look at this, I have a 2 and a 3 on the bottom, so I'm going to multiply by 6. How many terms do you see? I see 1 on the left and really one big gigantic one on the right, because that's really just one large multiplication problem. So I'm really just multiplying this one times 6, which becomes 1 and 3, so that becomes a 3. Multiplying this by 6, that becomes a 1 and a 2, and then 2 times 2 is 4. That means it's a 4 that I will then distribute, right? So now I have this problem over here, 4 times 2g plus negative 5. That becomes 8g plus negative 20. And you could be looking at this math problem with not a whole lot more work, and then you don't have to deal with those fractions. You might notice I didn't go ahead and solve those. That's because these are two-step equations, and that's not been taught yet. I just made them a little bit harder because I wanted to kind of have you practice counting the terms. So if you're looking at that, saying 1, 2, 3 terms, 1, 2, 3 terms, 1, 2 terms, because that determines how many things you have to distribute to clear the fraction. So now we have a couple of those one-step equations, so we can actually solve them. So I'll show it both ways. If I were going to clear the fraction, I'm looking at 9 and 3. 9 would actually be the common denominator, right? So it become a 1 and a 1 when I cross simplify this one, and that just turns into a 5b. I take this one times 9, it becomes a 1 and a 3, and that becomes 6. And you'd be dealing with that terribly difficult math equation, right? Or you could just say, oh, they took it times 5/9, took our variable times 5/9, so I'm going to divide by 5/9 or multiply by the reciprocal and do it to both sides, right? Remember, when you do it to both sides, those cancel out and you're just left with b equals the answer to this, which is, if you cross simplify, that becomes a 3 and a 1, and you get 6/5. You might recognize those from that equation I wrote just a moment ago. Simplify it, you get 1 and 1/5, so b equals 1 and 1/5. If I were doing this next problem, I would want to go to an improper fraction. So let me do that. That'd be 24 plus 3 is 27, so negative 27/4. Where's the equation? Oh, there's no variable, so let me just put an f there. Apparently I can't get things typed in properly. F equals 9/11. If you wanted to clear the fraction, that's one option. I'm going to go ahead and solve it first without clearing the fraction, then I'll show you clear the fraction. So if I wanted to undo that, I would divide by negative 27/4, divide by negative 27/4. Those cancel out, and you're left with f equals the answer to this. Of course, if I'm doing it by hand, I multiply by the reciprocal. One negative makes that answer negative, so my answer is going to be negative. Cross simplify, that becomes 3, that becomes 1, and I end up with 4/33. Remembering that our answer, of course, is negative, so negative 4/33. Again, I have it said I was going to take that and do it with clear the fraction, so let me go back and do that. That was negative 27/4. F equals 9/11. I would pick 44 to multiply by. That would be your common denominator for those. If I cross simplified this one, it would become 1 and 11. So then I would end up with negative 297. When I take this times 44, it becomes a 1 and a 4, and I get 36. And now I am in that algebraic equation. Negative 297f equals 36. I'll do this one also both ways. So if I were doing it right now, and I haven't done one in rainbow, so let me do it that way as well. W, they took it times negative 2/5 to get to negative 8. I'm going to divide by negative 2/5. And of course, that's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal, which is negative 5/2. So I'm really doing the problem negative 8 times negative 5/2. A negative times a negative is positive, right? And I can cross simplify and get 1 and 4. And your answer is positive 20. If I wanted to clear the fraction, I would multiply by 5. When I multiply by 5, here's a term and here's a term. Multiply that one, I get negative 40. Multiply this one, cross simplifies. 1 and 1, and I get negative 2w. Then I would just be dividing to get negative 2 divided by negative 2. Those cancel out, and you're left with w equals positive 20. To review, it doesn't really matter that these are rational coefficients. If you would have multiplied by 2, does it matter if it's multiplied by 2/7 or multiplied by 2.136? No. And if you added 4, does it make any difference if it's adding 4/9 or adding 4.35? It doesn't matter. You're just going to do the opposite. Subtract 4/9 or subtract 4.35. Divide by 2/7 or divide by that's supposed to be divide, by 2.136. It doesn't really change what we do. It just makes sure we are being able to deal with those fractions and decimals, other types of rational coefficients.